Hi there, I'm Bob Wormsley from INSYDIUM.
And I'm Mike Batchelor.
And welcome to INSYDIUM Live. Really good to have you with us. On the show today, we're actually going to do a bit of a round the horn, say hello to everybody in a second, but let's just tell you what's coming up a little bit later in the stream. We're going to do loads of cool technical breakdowns for you today. Later on, I'm going to be having a look at this scene. Now, you might have seen this one. We put this out on social. This one, this is one of yours, Mike, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And we've got loads of people asking how this was done. A really cool kind of dynamic shatter scene with some cool particles in there. So we'll be looking at that one. Also, Mike, you're going to be digging into this wildflower scene.
Yeah, we're going to use Taiao. We're going to look at the Taiao flower, Taiao leaf, and Taiao plant to build this really nice wildflower setup.
Very nice. And we're also going to be showing you a technique of how you can take very low particle count, quick to simulate grains sims and upres them very, very quickly. And the beauty of this technique, it means you can get a really detailed version of a low particle count sim, and it sims almost at the same speed. So it's really efficient. So the one on the left is the original low particle count scene, and obviously the one on the right is the upres. So we'll be looking at that. Now, before we get into any of these techniques, we need to say hello to everybody that is joining us online. Really good to have you with us, as we said. Now, let's have a look who we have here. We have got... let's address the first two questions that have come in straight away, Mike. Dean and also, is that pronounced Thies, have asked the question, are you compatible with Cinema 4D 2024 yet? The answer to that question is that there will be an update later this week, which means that the INSYDIUM Fused collection will work with the latest version of Cinema 4D, which is 2024. Loads of work going on behind the scenes to get that ready. Big job. And there will be an update later in the week.
Yep.
Excellent. That question's done. Let's just say that John Bosley is with us as well. John is in the chat. He's moderating for us today. He's answering your questions. And John is, as I call him, the human encyclopedia. He knows everything about INSYDIUM Fused and pretty much everything else in the world as well. So thank you, John. Let's say hello. We've got Peter in the chat. We've got Aria as well. Luke. Philippe, hello Philippe, Vincent, Moses, Doy, Mitchell. We had another guy, was it Michael, saying I've joined the X-Party cult or something similar,
Yeah, I saw that.
which I thought was a good one. Very good. It was Robert Walker who said that. Hey, Robert. We've got Tarek in the house as well. Martin, Linear Drift. That's a good name.
That's
Linear
very cool.
Drift. I'd like to know if that's on the birth certificate. That's a beauty. Right, let's crack on, though, with our technique breakdowns, because that's the main point of these streams, to pass on knowledge and all improve as artists. And, Mike, you're going to be looking at a scene first. So let's have a look at this quick render that you've done. I really like this one because it's quite similar to some of those kind of spawning NX question scenes that you've already demonstrated.
Yeah.
But this one has got a bit more of a kind of an organic, cohesive feel to it. It's a bit different.
Yeah, it's a really cool setup. There's no modifiers controlling the position of these. They're all doing it themselves using a combination of constraints and grow the scale using questions. So we'll show you how to build that.
Nice one. We'll jump into your cinema then, and you can fire away, Mike.
All right, the first thing we want to do is actually build a bit of geometry for them to emit from. So we'll just make a simple torus, and let's make that slightly thinner, put it on the Z plane, and holding down Shift, we'll add a twist modifier and just give that 180 degrees in the angle. So that's our piece of geometry that we want to emit from. I'm just going to bake this down so that we don't have any deformers or anything. So just current state to object, delete the original, and that's our bit of geometry. Okay, let's add an X-particle system. Oops, that is system sort. We don't want that one. X-particle system, and that's going to bring us a system with an emitter. And for tidiness sake, I'm just going to put the torus into our utilities. Right, we're going to get the emitter to emit from this object. So we're going to go to the Objects tab, change the emitter shape to Object, and put the torus into the object link. We want these to emit from the polygon area rather than center, so we just change that. Now we're going to go into the emission, and we're going to change the emission to shot. We're going to change it to simulate so we can see our particles, and that means we can hide this torus. And we're going to set it to 10,000 particles. All right. Let's drop the speed down to 0 because they're not going to be controlled by the emitter. And we're going to set the size to 1. Now that won't be visible because we're using a box display. So I'm going to go into display and change the mode to circles filled. And we'll leave everything else as it is. So the first thing we want to do is we want to control the color of these particles. So I'm going to go to modifiers, control modifiers, and we're going to choose the XP color. And the beauty of the XP color is we have access to the shader. So inside of the shader, we can select a noise, and this is going to do most of the work of this setup. So we're going to go into the noise, and we're going to change it to, I like blistered turbulence, it's quite a cool noise. We're going to pull this up. Let's just get a bit more real estate. We want it to be bigger, so let's say 500%. We want animation, so we want about 0.3 is a good speed. And then if we adjust the brightness and contrast of this, you can start to see it. So we go something like that because we want to keep the bright values. So the bright particles are going to be the ones that they scale up, and the dark ones won't get any scale. So something like that looks good. And if you push play, you'll see that it's animating, and that's going to help animate these particles. Okay, so let's go back to frame 0, and we will go into X-Particles, NeXus, and we want a question. So next question, and this is where we can start adjusting the radius. So we'll add a question, and the first question is going to stay on particles, and we want to adjust the color. And the vector is brightness because it's the brightness values that we're going to be working with. And all we need to do is say, is the brightness equal to a value of 1? And if it is, do something. So that's the very bright particles. So we're going to do an action, and they're going to set the action to change the radius. Radius, let's go for something like 10. And the weight, which is the strength of this, we're going to set this down to 2. So now if we come in and we push play, you'll see that they're starting to scale up, and that's already looking pretty cool. The only problem here is they're scaling up and they're not scaling back down to what they were, which is what we want them to do. So to do that, we will deselect this one, hold control, add another question, which drops it at the bottom. And this one we're going to set to else. So it's going to go, if they're brighter than 1, do this, or else, if they're not, do something else. And we'll set another action. We'll set them to radius again, and back to their default 1. And let's set this weight also to 2. So now we can push play, and you'll see they scale up and they scale down, scaling up and scaling down, which is already starting to get there. We want it to be a bit more dynamic now. So what we want to do is we want to have them push apart. So we'll go to NeXus, add a NeXus push. This one, we're going to set it to particle radius, maximum strength, and we'll put a mapping on there. So what we're going to do is map the color brightness to the strength. So it's going to be maximum strength on the white particles and no strength on the black particles. So let's push play. You can see they sort of burst into these little groups of pushed apart really cool particles. But that also introduces a new issue. So if we look at this one here, you can see it's now floating in space, and it's not being pulled back into its group. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to do that with the NeXus constraints so that we create these little springy systems between all these particles. So let's go to NeXus. We'll add a constraint. And the constraint we want is a birth. So we've got our birth constraint, the connection limit, which is how many particles between each particle it's limited to. I'm going to set this to something like 20, but we want a really high radius. So we want them to have a really big search radius in case any of these groups try and break away. So let's set this to 300. And we don't want them to break at all, so we'll set that to none. Now, if I push play now, you'll see a new issue. There's a problem. These particles, which have springs on them, are trying to fight against this push apart. So if I turn that push apart, there's not going to be any issues, but you're not going to get that dynamic motion. So we're going to mitigate that back in the constraints. We're going to use a friction between the particles. So we'll add a friction layer. And this one, let's say we have 20 particles with a radius of about 80% or centimeters. Let's push play. You can see it's mitigated that, it's slowed it down, getting these really cool forms. And you can see if the longer you play it, it starts to form this really nice organic motion. It's kind of like a living creature that's breathing and growing these little spheres. So that's the setup. It's already done. It's really simple, quite easy to do. But we thought we might have a look at how to render this as well using cycles. So we're going to go in. I've got a cycles set up here. We'll turn it off for now. And the first thing we need to do in cycles is add a light. So we'll go into the INSYDIUM menu, cycles, and we'll add just a softbox. So let's rotate this. Get it, rotate. And we'll lift it up so it's above our scene. And let's just scale it so it's slightly bigger. Something like that. Okay, now for cycles to see these particles, we need to put a tag on our emitter. So we'll go select the emitter, go to extensions, INSYDIUM tags, cycles, and we'll add a instance tag. And that just creates a sphere as an instance on each of these particles. So if we push play now they're visible in the viewport. If we go up a few frames so we can see some of these larger ones, start to see it looks really cool already. We haven't even done very much. We've just put a really simple softbox in the scene. But let's add a material. So we'll go in and we'll add a cycles 4D. We'll add an object material, which creates the principled BSDF node. We'll put that on our emitter. Okay, so we can close that, get a bit more space on our screen. And what we want to do is we want to control the color, and we can do that getting the original color by dragging the emitter into the node editor, creates a particle info node. And if we solo that, you can see there's the black and white values.
Can I just say, Mike,
Yeah.
I never knew that you could drag the emitter in to get the particle info node up.
Yep.
That's brilliant.
You can do it also with the cloner and the matrix objects. We'll bring a matrix info node. So there's quite a few things that can be dragged straight in. Right. What we want to do is we want to get that really nice glowing emission on some of these particles. So let's set that up. So we'll add a mix shader, which is going to be a mix between two shaders with a factor, which is like a blend between one and the other. So if we put that in there, it's not mixing with anything. So let's get our emission. And I'm hitting tab to get the little, this window up. And we're going to control it with a black body, because black bodies just look cool. So we can pipe that into there, that into there. And then you can see it's blending both of those together. And if you control the slider, you can have one or the other. But what we want to do is we want to use a mask. So let's just put that back to where it was. And we'll create a ramp to be our mask. So we're going to get a ramp, which is a gradient. And we're going to use the gradient that is our particle color. Like so. And if I solo that, there's our color again. And what we'll do is we'll make a little ramp here with just this nice little fine area of particles that you can control. And you can get this and you can move it around, and it'll choose different particles along this simulation. So find the right area for you and the right length, however many particles you want. So this is a nice little masking technique. All right, let's make it bigger and turn that off, and then we'll pipe that in as our mask. As you can see, it's now picking out just those ones and leaving all the rest as they were with their black and white values.
And the orange ones are emitting light. They're like light
They are
sources.
light, yeah, because it's an emission.
Yeah.
Okay, for the color, let's just cool this down by increasing the temperature to 3000. You can see that gives out that really nice yellow. We want way more glow, so let's put on, say, 4% in there, which hot makes it nice and hot. And then last thing I quite like to do is just put a bit of subsurface into these particles so that these ones get some of the, you can see the core of the particles. So we'll set this to random walk, and let's actually choose our nice yellow. So we get a bit of that bright yellow there. That's good. So, okay, and then we'll put our subsurface something like 0.6. You can see it, and you get a really nice glowing, cool looking particles. Really easy, really simple setup, this one. Even in cycles, it's not much going on, but it's really effective. It looks really nice when it's rendered. So that's how to use noise or a shader to control the radius of particles.
Brilliant. It's amazing, isn't it, that you can get something so simple but to look so cool very quickly. Love that. Right, thanks, Mike. Let's move on now. And what we're going to be having a look at, we're going to stay in NeXus, actually, and we're going to have a look at this scene, which you may remember when we had the latest release out. And this is upres. And what this is doing is the left-hand simulation is a very low particle count grains sim, and the right one is a very high resolution one. But if you've ever tried to actually do this, make a high resolution version of a low particle count fluid sim, it can be quite tricky to get it to look the same. So let's jump into my cinema, and we'll have a look at how we can do this quickly and easily with NX upres. So in this scene, what we have is an XP join with these two bits of simple collision geometry in. The join has got a collider tag in, so this is going to be our collision surface. And then we've got an XP emitter, and it's in box mode, this elongated box. Then if we go into the emission settings, you can see that the emission type is set to shot, so it'll just be on one frame. The shot type is set to hexagonal. We have no speed, and we have a radius of 3 centimeters. And what that does, if we go forward, it births these spherical particles in this hexagonal grid, and it uses the radius to pack them in this regular grid so they're not intersecting. And this gives us the perfect starting point to then have a granular simulation on these particles. We've got an NX gravity in the scene with a default gravity strength. Let's set up the fluid solve. So we'll go to NeXus, NX fluids, and we need to change the solver for granular from PBD to SPH. That enables us to change the fluid type from liquid to granular. Now, with a grains sim, you need a very high velocity solve to get that nice clumping to work. And you increase the velocity solve by increasing the substeps, by dividing each frame up into smaller chunks. So let's just put this, we'll try 11. And then we're going to go down to our granular settings, bump up this particle-to-particle friction, hit play, and yeah, we've got what looks like a grain solve. Really low resolution, obviously, not much detail to it at all, but we're getting this clumping particles. And the cool thing about doing a low-res one is look how fast the playback is. I mean, it's just real time. So now, let's say we're happy with the shape of that and how it's working. Now we want to do a much higher particle count version. This is where the problem starts. Let's duplicate this emitter. Oh, no, I've duplicated the fluids. We'll undo that and duplicate the emitter. Bring it over here. And in this duplicate emitter, this one, we will go to the emission tab and we'll give it a radius of 1. So there'll be loads more particles being born. And in the display, we'll put it onto squares, something like that. So now if we hit play, we've got two simulations. We've got our low particle count one and our much higher particle count one, all with the same fluid settings, but you'll see the higher particle count one gives us this awesome sim. It looks fantastic. but it looks nothing like the low particle count one. This big chunk here has been split up into 3 chunks. So it doesn't look the same. And this could be an issue for you. If you're trying to art direct this, this is a problem. So instead of doing it like that, what we are going to do, let's just delete that emitter. We are going to create one based on this low particle sim. So let's go to utilities. I'm going to cache it out first. So we'll bring in a cache object. And just in default, I'll hit build cache. This is going to fly through the cache almost real time. So it's going to be what? 300 frames, just over 10 seconds. 7, 8, 9, 10. I lied, it was 11. Right, there we go. Let's switch off the fluids and the gravity. We don't need any solvers here. This is cached to disk. Okay, so what we'll do, let's get our emitter, hold control and make a copy. And I'll just delete that cache tag on that copy. Don't need that. So this is a live emitter. And in the live emitter, we're going to go and we're going to our emission tab. And let's put it down to 1 centimeter radius again. And in the display, we'll do the same thing. We'll put it down to squares and maybe reduce the size of those down to maybe 50% there. Okay. And now I'm going to make my original particles. In fact, both of these emitters, we don't need to be looking at this box. So let's go with both of them selected, go to the display and uncheck draw emitter. And then our original one that's cached, let's make it invisible. So now if we hit play, we just have our new particles that are not doing anything because we have no modifiers in the scene. So this is what we'll do. We'll go to NeXus and we'll bring in an NX upres, which requires a source emitter and a destination emitter. So the source emitter is our cached emitter, obviously. The destination one is our new one. And we want to get the velocity information from the particles in the source, and actually we want the color as well. Now we've done that, if we hit play, we're going to get half of it working. Let's have a look. So they're moving, but we haven't got the color. And also, if I leave it playing, you'll see if I move up, we're getting a bit of an upwards drift. After that initial velocity, which looks right, we're getting this upward drift. So we need to fix both of those things. The reason the color isn't working properly, it's not getting the color from the source particles is, and this is a really good tip to know, if you are using NeXus and any modifier in NeXus that is trying to set particle color, so NX upres, NX blend, NX question can all do that, you have to have the emitter in the display options, you have to have it in single color mode for it to be able to then set the color. So in single color mode, if I hit play, this is going to work, but yeah, look, can you see there's a bit of flashing, which isn't right. Now, what is happening if we go to the NX upres? Each destination particle is searching for its nearest 3 source particles, and it is getting the velocity data and the color data from it, and it's being interpolated. And we're getting this flashing because the nearest 3 particles may be changing frame to frame with totally different colors. So we don't have enough kind of sample detail for it to be a consistent color change, a smooth color change. So let's just increase that accuracy by just saying, look, you have to look at 11 of your nearest particles instead of only 3. Let's hit play, and that should have smoothed out our colors. Yes, now we've got a really nice color blend. Now we're getting this rising velocity value, and it's happening just because it's the way in which the very slow moving velocities are kind of blending once we've got this initial fall downwards, and we need to sort this out. It's very simple to sort it out, and actually it unlocks some more artistic control for us. What we're going to do is reactivate this NeXus gravity. But if we just put it down to about half, like maybe 400 centimeters, now we're going to see really good velocity and it's falling down, looking perfect. And if we make our original particles visible and just on off our new ones, you'll see, look, we've got pretty much the same particle sim, but in this much higher detailed version. So that's really cool. But what we can do more with this now, because we're still using a live system. If we go to our gravity and put it back to the default, what's going to happen is we're going to get the initial velocity from the original sim, but then the gravity will start pulling them down strongly, and it gives us this like melting effect. Look, and then they're melting away. So that's pretty cool. Bit of additional control should you wish to have it. I'm just going to put that back to 400 though. And another thing you're able to do to make this a bit more kind of clumpy and more rigid, if speed isn't an issue to you. So at the moment, we've got a really fast simulating higher res sim, which is great. And that might be important to get the job done. But if speed isn't the issue, you just want it to look the same, but be higher res, we can add more detail by bringing the NX fluids back in, and it kind of does that solve as well. And it'll be a lot slower because it's having to do a lot of calculations, but look how rigid these clumps, these blocks of ice have become when we kind of do the fluid solve, almost doing the fluid solve twice. So that is an example of how we can do that upres for different effects, either to get a really quick upresed version or to have kind of stylistic control over an upres version that looks pretty much the same shape as the very quick low particle count first one.
It's a cool rig that. I've had one question asking what size your collider is.
Let's have a look. Do you know what? I do not know the answer to that question. So let's have a look. The cube, this is just a default cube, which is 1,000 units in the Z and then 200 by 200 in the X and Y. So it's a standard scene cube and then elongated massively. So it's a pretty big scene.
It is.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is, Mike, you're going to be jumping into, we're going away from NeXus now, you're going to be having a look at Taiao,
Yep.
and you're going to be demonstrating how actually quite quickly and easily we're going to be able to recreate this wildflower meadow. So let's jump back into your cinema, Mike.
Yep.
And you can take us away.
Here we are, and you can see I've got a reference of this actual plant, which is it's called Forget-Me-Not, and I think it's a European little wildflower that grows around in some of these parks here. So first thing we're going to do is concentrate on the flower. We'll just zoom in a little bit. We've got two parts. We've got this part where you can see the sepals in this kind of like cone shape, then the petals, and some then the rest of that. So let's go to this INSYDIUM Taiao, and we're going to add a Taiao flower. Let's just zoom in. I'm going to put wireframe on just for now. Okay, so we've got it broken down into parts, and we can turn some of the ones we don't want to focus on off. So let's turn off the stamen and the petals, and we can focus on the pistil, receptacle, and the sepals. So let's bring this up. Okay, so we want to create this little crown here. So first thing we're going to do is make it thinner. So we go to the pistil, and we're going to set the width down to 1, drop the height slightly, and we'll do the same to the receptacle. So we always want these two to kind of match depending on the flower, but generally they will match because they kind of blend into each other in reality. Right, let's drop the height slightly of that, and then what we want to do is make this more curved here, and we can do that with the profile spline. Let's just bring this end down and increase the curve, and that's just going to help it sit better when it's attached to any of the branches. Okay, so let's look at these sepals. So we'll select the sepal. First thing is 5 of them. So we'll set that to 5, and we will just adjust a few things so that they kind of orientate properly. So we're going to lower the position down slightly, about there, bring those in like that. So that's all right so far. We're going to go to the modifiers, and by default there's one furling modifier, and we'll use that to sort of bring out this base into a little arc here. So let's change the shape so it's up, and we can control the bias so it's just talking to the bottom part of these petals here. Now we want to start working on the actual shape so they're not going to intersect as much. So we go to the geometry, and we've got our profile, and that's the shape of this. So let's add a point here, and we're going to take this bottom one right down, and this is a bit of working. Really, you sort of spend your time working on these shapes to get exactly what you want, and it's worth spending the time on these splines and the tangents to get them as clean as you can. So something like that's not too bad. And then back in the modifiers, if we add a fold, which is going to fold this in half, we have this shape which is half of the shape of the leaf, and if we bring it down, we're going to create this curve, and that curve is what it's going to drive when you control the fold angle. So you can see that, fold it in, you get those really nicely tightly compact here. You can adjust that a little bit more, just bring those slightly up to just get them touching. That's better. So we're creating this really cool little cone here that's holding it up. And then we'll go back and we'll add one more fold modifier, furling modifier, just to bring these tips back out. So open it up like that, just drag this up. Something like that looks quite good. And that's that shape there that we want it to build. Right. So now we can do pretty much the same thing with the petals. So let's enable petals, and we'll go to the main tab. We'll set the petal to 5, because there's 5 of these petals as well. And let's orientate those up like so, and we'll adjust the shape. So we go to the geometry. They're a lot smaller and thinner. So, and then we can bring this down, bring it down a bit more. And then we'll go to the modifiers. It's already got a fold and a furling, and so we'll control this furling, something like that, so bring them away from each other. You can see we want it to be a little bit wider, so go back to geometry, bring that like that, a little bit thinner here, and then just want to fix this orientation. Go to the orientation and add some twist into it, and that's just going to pull them off each other slightly like that. So there we've got this petals. We've got a little issue here, so we can fix that again. We'll go to our geometry, just clean up anything you can with the geometry tab, and if you need more points, just add them in. It's really forgiving with the geometry here. So that. Okay, so that's fairly close. And then the last thing is the stamen, which is actually made up of these little spheres. So we'll enable the stamen, and they're kind of standard plant stamen here. What we want to do is we want to change the geometry so that they're little spheres, and we can do that with these tools. So first thing, we'll go to the main tab, and there's 5 of these as well. We need to set them to walled as a distribution mode so that they're in a nice little circle. Go to the geometry, and here's our shape. So if we remove this knot here, bringing this one down, and basically what we want to do is we want to create like a half a circle or half a sphere with these spline points, something like that. So if you imagine this is a sphere going around, and then all you need to do is just drop down the height, and you've got these little balls. So we can make those a bit bigger, and let's move them up slightly and change their radius, something like that, 0.8. Okay, it needs to come down a bit. Okay, so there's the basics of a flower, and I'm just going to add some materials. If I go open the materials, I've got these, and they are really simple standard cinema shaders with a gradient. That's it. They're all just a gradient just to give us a basic shader, but this can be rendered in any render engine, so whatever material you add will be renderable. We're just using standard for the viewport. So we'll select each element, go to their materials tab, and drag in the associated material. So we've got stamen, got petal, and the materials, drop in our petal, same for pistil, sepal. Whoops, and let's get the materials tab open, and receptacle. So there's our basic little flower, and again it's going to be tiny, so that's as detailed as you really need to go for this flower. So we can hide that and focus on building a leaf. So we're going to go back to INSYDIUM menu, Taiao, and we're going to add a Taiao leaf, which creates this default geometry. Let's add some more segments in here. So we go 12, by 4, just to get more detail into that leaf. And the profile here is the actual shape that we're going to build. So let's select it, bring it down. We're going to add in 2 points, something like that, and then just round off these tangents like so. That looks pretty good. Okay, so there's the basic shape of it. Let's add some edge noise just to break that up a bit. And you can adjust the scale as well if you need to, but I'm quite happy with that. And then we'll add a mid vein to it. So we go into the veins and enable veins, and it just creates this vein geometry here. Let's bring down the profile and lower this width as well. Something like that. That was good. And then just add a little bit of a petiole offset like that. Okay. Last thing we want to do is just add some modifiers. So we'll go into the modifiers tab. We'll add a fold. We'll do the same thing. We'll create that nice curve. Let's bring up the fold. And then we want to make it so it's not so folded up on the end. We can do that with the spire spline. Let's just drop that down. Something like that looks cool. Then let's add two more. We'll add a furling. So we've got, looks like a bit of gravity and some turbulence. Some turbulence, just increase the bias, bring it up, and then we can adjust the scale so that it's not so intense. Something like that looks pretty good. Okay, so there's our leaf. Let's put a material on here. So we've got a material slot slightly different to the flower. If we put our, let's say, our leaf material and our stem in, they need to be assigned to the parts of the leaf. So the leaf here is assigned to leaf, and then stem, we're going to assign that to the stem and mid vein. And you can see it's assigned it to just that center part. Great, so there's our leaf. Let's hide that, and we'll work on the plant itself. So we'll go to Taiao, add a Taiao plant. And the first thing we want is a trunk, which is going to be our stem. So add a trunk, and you can see the trunk by default is huge because it's kind of designed to build trees. So all we need to do is adjust the height. So let's say these flowers in the wild kind of range between 45 and 60 centimeters. So let's set that to 45. Then we'll set the radius all the way down to 0.3. So we've got our stem there. And you can also see that it's quite low poly. So let's fix that by going into the global settings and adjust the segment resolution all the way down to 1. You can see that gives us way more geometry, which helps for the detail. Now let's drop a material on this layer. Let's go to materials, and we use the stem. And there's this button which will propagate this material onto any further trunks and branches. So let's enable that, and that's all we have to do. Any branches that are added will get this material. Let's get rid of wireframe so we can see our plant. Right, so this needs to be nice and bendy. So we go to our plant, modifiers, and let's add a turbulence. Just drop the strength down like that. You can increase the scale so it's not quite so bendy. Something like that looks good. Now this can be cycled through the seeds. If you want to find something slightly different, just cycle the seeds until you're happy with what you get. So I quite like that one, a couple back. Yeah, that looks good. Right, let's add some branches. So we're going to select our trunk, add a branch, which creates these branches. We don't want this one on the end because that's more useful for trees than it is for this. So we're going to turn that off. And let's say we've got 5 branches. We want these to be going up. So we can put some angle in there and some variation, and we'll adjust the curve in a second. Now, these branches on plants tend to be longer at the base and go shorter as they go up because they're younger. So we can do that with this little fill down. We've got the length along branch. So you can drop that down, and we'll increase the length as well, so that you can see the ones at the bottom are longer than the ones at the top, which is a bit more natural. Let's close that down, and everything else is fine in here. So let's look at the modifiers. Again, we'll add some turbulence, and it's a bit extreme because it's for trees. So we just drop the strength down to wherever you need it. Something like that looks good. You don't need frequency, just bias it off so it's not right on the end there. And we'll add a furling layer. So with this one, we're going to have them going up. And just adjust the bias so it's further down the branch. Always add variation into these because nothing's exact in nature, so variation is really important. Like that, looks good. And then we want one more so they sort of bend down like this guy here. It's a bit heavy because he's got all the flowers on it. So let's add another furling layer. And you can see they've gone back to straight. And the reason for that is because these layers need to be blended. So all you do is blend that using the add, and you can see that's back, and we can add the blending in. So like that, some variation. Cool, that looks good. So now we're ready to start adding another branch layer for putting our flowers on. So select that, add another branch layer. Again, it's created these little branches here. So we'll go say 7. And we don't want the one on the end. And these definitely going to angle up like that. Put variation. Again, the branch length down like that looks good. And then we'll go to modifiers and we'll add gravity. So we want them to go up. So we use a negative gravity. So something like 250. Bring that up and some variation. It's looking good. And then let's curve them because they're going to have flowers on them. It's going to be heavy, so we use furling. So they furl down, and let's make it just on the tips. Some variations in there. Now, you can see the resolution here is starting to drop. So it's getting quite blocky here, and you go fix that by global settings. Just reduce the resolution. We're going to leave it as it is because it's a small plant. You're not really going to see it. So it looks fine. So let's put some flowers on. So with this branch selected, we'll go to add part and we're going to add custom object, which creates these little objects. That's not what we want on there. We want our flower. So let's enable the flower, drag it in, and you can see it's now added those to all those branches. They're really big, so we can just drop the size, bring that down, something like that. Variation in there as well. And we'll put some variation in the heading. So we'll set that to 360 with 100% variation. So they're all slightly different in their orientation. So that's looking cool. But there's a thing you'll note that these branches without a branch on the end, you can see they're missing a flower. And we can do that by control dragging our custom object, which creates a new one. Close this branch and drop that into the chain. You can see it pops it on there. We can lower the position so it's blending better, and we'll do one more for the main stem here. So go back here, control drag, close this branch, pop it into the chain, and then it pops out there. So just fix the position and make it a bit bigger because it's on the tip there, so it looks better. Okay, so the last thing we need to do to call it done is get the leaves on there. So with our plant, select the trunk, add part, we're going to add leaves, and that leaves our add leaves. So turn off the one on the end because we don't want that. Distribute it. I'm just going to bring them down slightly, something like that. Then we go to geometry and change the mode to custom. Drop in our leaf, and you can see it's putting those leaves on the plant. So go to the main tab, we can adjust the size, and again, like the branches, they're going to be smaller the further up because they're newer. So we could just adjust that size there and something like that. Put some variation, and then we'll go to orientation, orient them up, put some variation in that. And just like that, you've already built this plant, which is looking all quite cool all by itself. So as it's procedural, again, anything you want to change, like the seeds, you can just go back to the modifiers and adjust that. So I'm going to put those in there, which is just for being tidy. And to add lots of them, go to your add part, growth point, just drop that into the growth point, and it creates all these little clones. Adjust the size of that. So if you select that, you've got a variation here. So it changes different variations. Increase the count, bring in that width. And just like that, you've got this really nice patch of wildflowers ready for your render.
Brilliant. It's interesting, Mike. Michael Schlapsky's with us on the in the chat, and he said
Hi, Mike.
he loves watching people work in Taiao. Very kind of satisfying, and it's almost like meditation. I could totally relate to him. I could sit and watch you twiddle around in Taiao all day long.
I can play in Taiao all day long as well. It's just quite a fun project.
Right, we're going to get on to our final demonstration in a second. Before I do, we're actually talking about the granular and fluid simulation that we did earlier on. Linear Drift was asking, is scale important if you're just doing kind of a fluid sim where it doesn't have to be kind of ultra realistic like a glass fill? And scale actually is important. It does fundamentally change how your simulation will work and will be calculated.
Yep.
And so I would always advise, if scale isn't important to the scene that you're doing, like it's an abstract scene and you just want some nice fluids, then it's always really good to work in kind of, it's almost the default Cinema 4D scale. So if you're bringing in a default cube at 200 scene units, 200 centimeters for what I work in, then use a particle radius that works in that scale. So, you know, a radius of between 1 or 3 centimeters, which is the default in X-Particles. If you need realism, you may need to scale your particles down really tiny to maybe 0.1 of a centimeter, but then that will change the way in which the whole solve works, and it means you're going to need loads more substeps, especially if you're using a gravity with the default settings.
Yeah.
So I just looked up so I could point you in the right direction here. We have actually got some fluids training on our YouTube channel, which explains this exact point, and I kind of demonstrate some of the scenes to show you the difference. So if you just search on the INSYDIUM training, it's called Maintenance Training, Dynamics Fluids, and there's a solver choice one called Glass Fill, and the thumbnail is filling up a glass. And that goes through the effects of scale on the scenes and the difference it makes really kind of in detail. And that'll give you, that should give you the knowledge. But the simple answer is, if scale isn't ultra important to you, work at the default scene scale in Cinema and X-Particles, and you'll get a nice, really cool solve. Right, let's move on. And this is another animation that we put out on social, Mike. And this one is one of yours, actually. And this one got loads of response asking how it was done. Because obviously it's a shatter simulation. We can see those nice shards, but it's also got some dynamic particles which are interacting with that. And it's a really good look, this. I like this one. So we'll look at rebuilding this one because, like all of the good scenes, it's actually quite simple. So in my scene here, we have got an X-particle system which doesn't have any X-particles objects in it at all at the moment. We have a Cinema 4D text spline and 2 planes. Let's just make those disabled for now. So the text spline is just in the field here. We've got it animated from 5 every second. It changes to a new number, 3, 2, 1. And we're going to use this object to create our shards. So we'll go to our generators. Let's bring in an XP shatter, and we'll make our plane, there it is, a child of the shatter. And then straight away, we have got our obvious kind of Voronoi shards. In our XP shatter, in the display options, by default, we've got draw cut edges, which is drawing these edges blue. We don't need that because actually we're viewing the lines in Cinema 4D, so there's no point. But what we will do is just draw the shatter points just to explain how this is working quickly. If we click that on, you can see, look, there is a point for every shard. Let's go to our Object tab. So by default, when you open it, you get a Voronoi layer, and as a child, you get a point generator. And it's this point generator that's randomly generating these points. Look, we've got a number of 40, and then they're kind of driving that Voronoi algorithm to make these shards per point. But we don't want it to be random, so let's just delete that out, and all of our shards go. We want to use the text spline. So what we do is drag the text spline as a child of the Voronoi, and now, look, it's generating points around that spline, which is giving us these shards that aren't quite right yet. And the reason it's all even like this is because in our text spline, it uses the intermediate points to generate the points. And look, we've got intermediate points set to uniform 20, which is giving us a lot of intermediate points. But we don't want to do that because it's not looking right. So what we're going to do, instead of using the object points, we're going to generate points along the spline. And then this gives us control to generate as many points as we want along that spline. By default, it's set to 10, so we've got our 10 points. Let's put this up to, say, 500. And it's looking very similar. So why are we doing it? Well, this is the key. What we're able to do now is offset these points from the spline like this. Look, and as we offset them, look what happens to those shatter shards. We can now go to the display tab and take draw shatter points off. And there we have got that basic look. That's what we want. And because this is procedural, it will respect it when it animates to our next numbers.
Cool.
Very nice. So let's make this look a bit better. In the XP shatter, we'll go to object. We want to create some gaps between shards. So we'll just go to the Voronoi layer, which is doing all the calculations. And then the offset, let's put it at, say, 3 centimeters. And now we have gaps. So now what we're going to do is we're going to activate this other plane, which is sitting just below our shatter plane. And we've made it orange. And we get this look. And because we've got a light in the scene with shadows, we're getting this nice, cool shadowing look. Let's just make our plane darker. If I go to my material manager, we've just got a viewport material here. Let's put it on the shatter. And then immediately you can see that we've got that quite stylistic look. And this is looking very nice, which changes when our number changes. Fantastic. But the problem is it's not really feeling dynamic yet. And for that, we need to use particles. So let's switch off our shatter and we'll switch off that orange plane. And we will bring in our emitter. So let's go to the emitter null. We'll create an emitter. The emitter, we're going to go to the object tab and change it from rectangle to object. That lets us put in our text spline as the object we want to emit from. And we want to emit from not the polygon center, but the edges. Then we'll go to the emission tab. We're going to set it to shot. We don't want that many particles. 200 is probably enough. We're going to take the speed off. We're going to put the radius at maybe 2, but with a variation of 1. And then in the display tab, we're going to, just at the beginning, put this on the sphere display type, which gives us these nice shaded spheres. And we hit play, nothing happens at all. They're just born. So now what we want to do is we want them to be kind of pushed around and follow almost the flow of these splines as the text changes. So we'll do that by making a custom velocity field. So let's go to dynamics. We'll bring in an XP flow field. There we are. And what this does, it creates a custom velocity field inside this bound. So let's just bring that down. I'll explain these squiggly lines in a minute. So something like that. So what we have here, these lines are the velocity vectors. They're displaying the direction and the strength of the force which will be moving these particles around. We can change that display. Let's go to the display. We can change it from trail to arrow, which kind of makes it look a bit more obvious. And we're just viewing a 2D plane of these just because it's lighter in the viewport. And that's, look, we've got the XY plane. But if we put that on voxels, we'll see all of them. And we can make this a more detailed kind of high resolution velocity field by reducing this grid size, a bit like reducing voxel size. So let's go to object, cell size, put it down to say 15. And now we've got kind of a higher detail velocity field. Now, the reason the arrows are sticking out in all directions is because by default, the flow field brings in a random layer, but we don't want that. So let's delete it. Instead, we're going to add a layer and we want the along spline. Click that. Here's our along spline layer. And it's saying, what spline do you want to use in this object here? So let's drag in our text spline. And now look what we've got. We have got these arrows which are following that spline. Now they're yellow near the spline and they're graduating out to blue. And that's showing the strength. Yellow is strong, blue is not. And the reason we've got that is that by default, there is a fall off over 50 centimeters away from the spline. And here is the fall off curve going from full strength down to 0, and we can see that. But actually, we don't want any fall off at all. We just want this to be a consistent force inside our bounds. All right, excellent. So what we're going to do is put our strength up to 100%. And if I hit play, we're not going to see anything. There's no movement whatsoever. And the reason there's no movement is, let's just make the flow field invisible. The reason there's no movement is that by default, the flow field is set to direction. So it's not giving the particles any speed. It's just pointing them in the direction we want. And because the particles have no speed, they're not moving. So what we'll do is go to our emitter, emission tab. Let's give them a bit of their own speed, maybe 20 and a bit of variation. And now when we hit play, we should start getting, yes, look, we're getting a flow that's changing when our numbers change. Cool. So that's working. Now we need our particles to be a little bit more dynamic and interact with each other. And what we'll do is we'll use a push. Now, all of these are X-Particles CPU tools, but we can mix it with GPU tools as well. So let's go to NeXus. We'll bring in an NX push. We'll have the distance mode set to particle radius. Let's just leave it like that. And now we should get them pushing and colliding and moving each other around as they're moving around. So that's looking pretty good. Excellent. So now what we're going to do is let's go to our emitter display. And now that we can see what's happening, let's change that display back to squares. We'll force display, so we'll see it immediately. And then we can use this display size factor to make them bigger or smaller. Let's make them slightly bigger, something like that. And now what we're going to do, if we reintroduce our shatter and our bottom plane and play through, we're getting this, and it still doesn't feel quite right. And that's because it's disconnected. This is the cool part, and this is what makes the scene really good, is that we can use these particles as additional shatter points, which will suddenly make this whole thing feel alive. So let's go to XP Shatter. All we need to do is put let's just go forward a frame so we've got particles. We'll put our emitter as a child of the Voronoi as well, use object points, hit play, and now look, we have got these dynamic shards which are changing and moving with our dynamic particles. And we're getting this flow around our letters, which is working really well. Now, this works in Mike's render. He actually rendered these particles, which look really cool. But actually, you've got options. You can render it without actually seeing the particles and just have them drive these dynamic shards. And it gives this nice kind of fluid motion to this countdown. So that works really well. Or you can choose to have the particles as part of your scene, and they can all be rendered at the same size, which gives you this almost kind of like a digital look to this organic scene. Or you could render them with the particles actually showing their full radius. Obviously, you'd have a shader that wasn't just blue, but that in its own right is quite an interesting look as well. So, as usual, pretty simple techniques and a pretty simple scene, but it looks really effective. And the final look, we can see the viewport and then the beauty render there. So, yeah, really good one, that, Mike.
Very cool.
I like that one. So what we'd like to do is, obviously, we always want to hear from you when you've got ideas of what kind of videos, what breakdowns, and what kind of training you want us to do. So please do continue getting in contact and telling us. Michael was saying that he loved, Michael, you and a million others loved the star walking scene. That's one of our shorts that we put out. I think that was last week.
Yeah.
And this was a motion, I don't actually have the video with me, but it's the motion capture scene with some amazing amazing swirling, advecting, sparkly particles. It was a really, really good scene. So yeah, we will be looking at that one and seeing how we can demonstrate the technique, because that was a much requested one. But if you've got any techniques yourself, or you want a top tip, or there's any areas, please do get in contact with us. Probably the best place to do that is when we're live. Do it here on the messages, because I'll go through every message afterwards to make sure that we've got our heads around them all. And if we're not live, you can of course look at our Discord channel, and obviously we've got our own community there. And we can collate all of those requests on the Discord channel. So for information on that, just go to the INSYDIUM website, and the details of how you join and how you get on there are all available, and it's all pretty simple stuff.
We just had a little final question asking if you could extract the shatter cuts as splines, and you could do that with the edge to spline mesh tool quite easily. Just make that shatter a child of the edge spline, and you'll get those as a separate spline object.
Yeah, if you go to INSYDIUM mesh tools, and I'm not on, am I? That would help. There we go. INSYDIUM mesh tools, and where am I looking at, Mike? Edge spline here would extrapolate those. Obviously, you wouldn't get. Would you get the cuts? I'm not sure, Mike. Let's do. Let's just take the emitter out for now and switch that emitter off. And what I'll do is let's just take off the offset. So we've got our edges. And then what are you saying, Mike? Putting the shatter inside the edge spline. Where have I put my edge spline?
I don't think you had it.
Mesh tools, edge spline. There you are. Standard. And where's my shatter? Put my shatter in there. Yeah, there we go. Let's just turn that depth of field off so we can actually see what we're doing. Yeah, so there we've got, but the issue that we have there,
not seeing the n-gons.
It's not seeing the n-gons. So that's an interesting one, though, because that would be a very useful technique. I'm going to take that away, have a look at that, and see if we can come up with a way of getting that to work. So what's happening there is the XP shatter quite cleverly, it obviously has to make loads of polygons and loads of cuts to make these shards work, but then it recognizes what needs to be a shard, and it creates an n-gon which gets rid of all of those lines, which means that we then get this very clean shards.
Yep.
But the edge spline is seeing all of the underlying polygon edges.
Yep.
But I will have a look at that, because that would be good. And that could even be a feature request if it isn't possible at the moment.
Definitely.
Yeah. Nice one. Okay, so just to remind you that Cinema 4D 2024, there will be an INSYDIUM fused update, which will have compatibility for 2024, and that is going to be out at the end of this week. Okay, so we'll let you know where the next live stream is going to be. It's been really good hanging out, doing some techniques, answering your questions. So thanks so much for doing that and for joining in. Looking forward to the next one, and we'll let you know when that is going to be. But that is it from me. See you later.
See you later.